You grew up in the last window of human consciousness that developed without algorithmic feedback. Your brain literally wired itself differently than someone born in 2005. This isn't nostalgia, this is neurology. There's a specific threshold, roughly 1995, where human childhood cognition split into two divergent paths. Before that line, you learned to wait. You learned what boredom felt like for hours. You learned that answers weren't instant, and that made you patient. You learned that social interaction happened in delayed waves, not real-time streams. You memorized phone numbers because you had to. You sat in silence because there was nowhere else to go. You developed in an information scarcity environment. Your brain built itself in that gap. And now as an adult, watching a generation that has never experienced true boredom, you feel something you can quite name. It's not superiority, it's something closer to witnessing the extinction of a cognitive style you didn't know was rare until it was gone. The thing is, neuroscience is now showing you something you've suspected but never heard confirmed. Your slower way of thinking isn't outdated. It's structured around a fundamentally different principle. You developed in an environment where patience wasn't a virtue, it was a requirement. When you wanted to know something, you couldn't Google it. When you wanted to talk to someone, you couldn't text them instantly. When you were bored, you couldn't scroll. So your brain, this incredibly adaptive organ, built networks optimized for that world. Your prefrontal cortex, the part that handles impulse control, deep focus, delayed gratification, developed through constant natural practice. It had to. But here's what happened next. The internet didn't just change how you access information. It changed the baseline neurological environment for everyone born after you. Someone who grew up with a smartphone didn't develop the same patience architecture because they never needed it. Their brain optimized for a different skill, rapid task switching, constant stimulus, real-time social feedback. They're extraordinarily good at that. But the cost is what researchers call attention fragmentation, the inability to sustain deep focus without external stimulation. It's not a personal failing, it's an adaptation to an environment where sustained focus isn't actually rewarded. Your childhood forced you to build something they never had to. The capacity for boredom to transform into creativity. Think about what actually happened during those hours when you were bored. Not the boredom itself, the aftermath. You were sitting in your bedroom with nothing to do, so your mind wandered. It drifted, it made random connections. Neuroscientists call this the default mode network, and it's where human creativity actually lives. It's where your brain makes new associations, solves problems you weren't consciously trying to solve, and generates the kind of insight that feels like it came from nowhere because it came from everywhere at once. Your brain had thousands of hours of practice at this unstructured, unsupervised, unstimulated time.
That's incubation. That's where ideas actually form.
Someone born in 2005 experienced comparatively little of that. Their boredom was optional. The moment discomfort arrived, there was an app, so their default mode network, the creative infrastructure of their consciousness, developed less, not because they're less creative, but because they weren't forced to sit in the discomfort long enough to use it. The paradox is that this actually makes you valuable in precisely the moment when the world is drowning in distraction. You're not more intelligent, you're not smarter, but you remember what human thinking looks like without constant external validation. You remember what focus feels like. You remember what it's like to not know something and to sit with that uncertainty rather than immediately resolving it through a search. There's something else that happened during your childhood that nobody talks about, and it's quietly reshaping how you move through the modern world. You developed your social confidence without real-time feedback. When you called a girl or a boy, you couldn't see them typing. When you said something awkward, you didn't have the anxiety of a read receipt. Your social interactions lived in this envelope of ambiguity. You never knew exactly what someone was thinking in the immediate moment, so you had to develop tolerance for uncertainty. You had to trust your instincts rather than constantly calibrating based on digital signals. This created a version of social confidence that's almost extinct now. Not superiority, just a different structure. Digital natives, by contrast, live in constant social surveillance. Every word gets a reaction, every message gets read and timestamped. The feedback loop is immediate and precise, so they developed a different skill, hyper-awareness of social perceptions. But the trade-off is that they're often more anxious about authentic expression because they can see the exact moment someone is judging them. You lived in information scarcity. That forced critical thinking by necessity. You couldn't fact-check instantly. You couldn't verify every claim, so you developed skepticism as a default operating system. You learned to hold multiple perspectives in your mind without immediately collapsing them into certainty. This actually makes you harder to manipulate by algorithmic content because your brain developed in an environment where information filtering wasn't outsourced to algorithms. It was your job, you had to think. Someone born after the internet was born into algorithmic curation, which is extraordinarily efficient, but also neurologically passive. They trust the system more because the system has always been making decisions for them. You trust the system less because you remember when you had to make those decisions yourself. The cost of this is something you live with daily and probably don't name it as such. You're nostalgic, not romanticizing the past, but genuinely grieving something specific, the cognitive space that no longer exists. You can go back to that way of thinking even if you wanted to. Your brain is neuroplastic, meaning it keeps rewiring itself, and you've adapted to the digital world, but adaptation isn't the same as original development. Part of you remains tethered to the way your mind worked before, and that creates a subtle exhaustion. You can focus deeply, but it requires effort now. You can sit with boredom, but you have to actively resist the impulse to check your phone. You remember what undivided attention feels like, and you know you've lost access to it in the way your childhood self took it for granted. There's also something quieter happening. Your generation is becoming increasingly conscious of being a bridge. You're not analog, you're not digital, you're bilingual in a way that's becoming rare. You can code switch between deep work and scattered multitasking. You understand why silence is valuable, and you understand why connection is valuable. You didn't have to choose between them, you grew up with both separately, and now you navigate them together. This is actually a form of cognitive diversity that modern culture desperately needs but doesn't quite know how to value yet. The thing to understand is this: you're not obsolete because you remember a slower way of thinking. You're a reference point. You hold in your neurological memory what human consciousness looks like without constant external optimization.
That's not quaint, that's rare.
And in a world where everyone under 30 is struggling with chronic attention fragmentation, anxiety, and the exhaustion of constant social performance, the fact that you remember what focus feels like, what boredom felt like, what patience felt like, that's not weakness. It's a form of literacy that's becoming increasingly precious. You're not the generation that missed the internet. You're the generation that remembers what human attention looked like before it became a commodity. That's not nostalgia, that's knowledge. If this lands somewhere true for you, subscribe. There's more like this coming.